Well, this is a video I never thought I would have to make, at least not this year. You know, if there's a Nintendo franchise I genuinely love, it's probably the Metroid series, especially the Prime trilogy. While definitely not perfect, all three games manage to give you a special feeling of isolation and adventure that can't be found in many other games. And while you can find some controversial design choices in the second and third title, they still are unique and multifarious enough on their own, even if I personally prefer Prime 1 over them. I'm probably going to make an extra video talking about Metroid Prime 3 soon, because I still have 250 gigs of recordings that I have to get rid of. But today I rather want to talk about Metroid Prime 4, the game that Nintendo just announced at E3 by showing a logo. And because everyone's currently still talking about it, I want to express my wishes and expectations for this game, now that we know it's actually a thing, and not some kind of joke like the entire Half-Life 3 meme anymore, which is relieving. Considering that we just saw a 20-second long teaser with a cheap logo that looks like it was fan-made, some might argue that you can't really expect anything yet. We know nothing about the game apart from the fact that it exists, that it's a first-person adventure similar to Prime 1, and that it's not developed by Retro Studios. But the fact that we already have 3 Prime titles make it rather easy to imagine how the final game will probably look like and what we should expect. My biggest wish for the overall structure of the game is that they go back to Prime 1's less streamlined and more open world approach. In the original Prime, the player always had to find out where he had to go or where he even could go by himself. Prime 3 was pretty much the opposite of that, with an Aurora unit always telling you what was going on. There were only very few situations where you were not told how to progress, and these usually caught me off guard because at that point I was already pretty used to not having to think on my own. It somehow worked and I was fine with it in Prime 3, but I still prefer the less linear playstyle of Prime 1 and 2. By less streamlined I also mean that they could give the player a bit more freedom when it comes to how a player wants to complete a task. Even in Prime 1, there's usually only one way to complete an objective, to beat a boss or to get an item. For example, there's only a single route that you have to walk to get to the gravity suit in Prime 1, and you'll walk this route every time you play through the game. Giving the player the choice to maybe take another route and another exit would have been neat. I'm pretty optimistic about this one, considering that Breath of the Wild already had a rather free approach when it comes to problem solving, and Mario seems to be taking the same route. It seems like Nintendo is going for a more open playstyle in their new games. And while that can hurt a franchise, it can also vastly improve the gameplay when executed correctly. When it comes to world design, I also remember reading an article from a few years back, in which either Tanabe or Sakamoto stated that if they would make a new Metroid Prime game, they'd use the two world system found in Echoes in a similar way again. Unfortunately, it was impossible for me to actually find the article in question, because the first 10 pages on Google are just filled with Metroid Prime 4 announced and some articles about Federation Force. If anybody knows the article I'm talking about, then feel free to post it in the comments. But even if I can't find the article again, the idea itself is still pretty good, but it would need some work. In Prime 2, the Dark World was a bit too similar to the Light World in some places, and you could see that Retro started to run out of time and ideas at the end, as some parts of the Sanctuary Fortress don't even exist in the Dark Aether at all. If they'd like to reintroduce the two-world system, they could say that the planet Samus is exploring is stuck in a time loop, which is why Samus can later switch between 2 different time periods. In one time period, the buildings and technology of a past civilization still exist, similarly to what you see in Metroid Prime 2. And in the second time period, everything would be taken over by nature, similarly to Metroid Prime 1. This wouldn't just guarantee more variety, but would also make interaction between the two time periods possible. This already existed in Metroid Prime 2, but was barely ever used. Another part of the Prime games that could need a bit more attention is the overall combat. Nobody ever really talks about the shooting aspect of the trilogy, considering it's not really a first-person shooter, but more a first-person adventure. And that is perfectly fine, but it doesn't mean that you can't add a bit more depth to your fight sequences. They tried adding more variety to the fights in Prime 3 by adding the grapple lasso, which usually ended in weird Wii remote shenanigans. But maybe they should lay their focus on the arm cannons in Prime 4. Giving the arm cannon a couple more features in combat would create some interesting mechanics. Maybe it could be possible to gradually upgrade one of your beams. For example, you could upgrade your let's call it plasma beam equivalent beam here, so it can't just melt through ice but also through steel or other armor, which would make it more effective against certain armored enemy types. At the same time, they could add different types of attacks. For example, beside the normal charge beam, you'd also have the possibility to continuously press the A button after the charge to prolong the time the beam lasts, but with the drawback that the beam cannon has to cool down afterwards. You could use this to deal critical damage against a boss weak spot, but you'd have to play much more defensively afterwards due to your beam weapon being temporarily disabled. These are obviously just all ideas that might sound good on paper, but are hard to actually implement into the game. Making the combat part of Metroid Prime a bit more complex could definitely help making the fights to a more fun and challenging experience, which is somewhat needed. After all, most of Prime 1 to 3's fights consisted of either quickly pressing the A button or holding it for a short amount of time and then releasing it. In the end, I just want to see Nintendo reusing the already well-known gameplay style of Metroid Prime, while still adding new creative ideas to it. I don't think it's necessary for Nintendo to completely rework the formula of the first-person Metroid games the way they reworked the 3D Zelda formula with Breath of the Wild just yet. But the chance that they want to play it too safe by barely changing anything and creating a Metroid Prime 1.5 is somewhat existent, especially with an easily enraged fanbase. I guess these were my ideas and thoughts on Metroid Prime 4. I know that it is really early to even talk about this game, but at the same time it's also pretty optimal, considering everything is still possible. Maybe when they'll finally show off the game someday, we'll find out it's actually a rail shooter, where you make photos of Metroids, and they renamed it to Metroid Snap or something. I don't know if I'd even be mad about that, to be honest. Do you have any wishes for Metroid Prime 4? Or do you think it's already doomed because it's not made by Retro Studios? Even though that's a pretty stupid argument in my opinion. If you want to see more, you can click on some buttons on screen right now. Or don't. I don't rule your life.